I am convinced that those societies, as the Indians, which live without government in their general mass, possess an infinitely greater degree of happiness than those who live under the European governments. Among the latter, under pretense of governing, they have divided their nations into two classes, wolves and sheep. I do not exaggerate. This is a true picture of Europe. Cherish, therefore, the spirit of our people. If once they become inattentive to public affairs, you, I, Congress, and the assemblies shall become wolves. It seems to be the law of our general nature, and experience declares that man is the only animal which devours his own kind. For I can apply no milder term to the governments of Europe, and to the general prey of the rich on the poor. Thomas Jefferson, letter to Edward Carrington, 1787. Good morning, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, Wandering Author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. And today, we're returning to early American history. We're going to be basically covering the ground between Bacon's Rebellion, which we talked last time, and the actual revolution. So we'll be ending today on the eve of the actual revolution. Now, that quote from Thomas Jefferson is from slightly afterwards, but I thought that it was, I always think quotes from our founding fathers are pretty interesting to read. And so, Abbott Smith talks about, in his book, Colonists in Bondage, about the forces that led the early American colonists to come over here. And he says that from the complex pattern of forces producing immigration to the American colonies, one stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them. And so what he's getting at there is, during early American history, over half of the people that actually came over here came as servants. They weren't free men. They would sign these things called indentures, and these were contracts that basically gave their masters, the people who paid for them to come over to America, 5 to 7 years of their service. And so, in early American history, even obviously there's tons of Indian and black slaves, but even amongst the white people, most of them were not free the way that we would conceive of them, right? And servants were not allowed to marry without their master's permissions. They could be separated from their families at will too. And 17th century Pennsylvania law states that the marriage of servants without the consent of the masters shall be proceeded against as for adultery, and children to be reputed as bastards. So the majority of early American colonists were not treated as equal people. And we can also see, by looking at Maryland and Virginia court records from the 1600s, that Bacon's Rebellion was not like alone in a vacuum. It was one of the largest rebellions of the servants, but there was actually quite a few of them. Free people had to display their passports to prove they were free men in the colonies. Now, John Locke, who is considered to be an inspiration to the Founding Fathers, wrote the Carolinas, before they were North and South Carolina, the Fundamental Constitution in the 1660s. And as this Constitution was pretty biased, 8 barons were given control of 40% of the colony's land, and they were given the right to be the governor exclusively. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, declared in 1630 that in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. So basically across the board, we could see similar trends to what we saw in what we were talking about yesterday in Greece, which is that human society in general seems to be composed of people with power, and those are generally few, and a whole bunch of people who don't have power. In Boston, the colonial tax records say that by 1770, just before the actual revolution, the top 1% of taxpayers, property owners, held 44% of the colony's wealth. And in New Jersey, there were a wave of farmer rebellions in the 1740s and 1750s, about 20 to 30 years before the revolution, whenever these wealthy landowners demanded rents of them. Samuel Baldwin was actually imprisoned. He was a poor farmer for occupying his land, and then 200 other colonists would break him out of jail. There's also rebellions against basically the draft. So like in in early American history, there's like the 7 Years' War between England and France, and there's this thing called impressment, which is where they force people to serve on the ships. And there was riots in Boston in 1747 against that too. Now, the French colonists, what's really interesting is if you look at how people were treated in the actual colonies versus how they were treated in the Indians, a lot of these indentured servants and slaves would run away from the colonies and go to the Indians. And there was a French colonist, Saint John Crevoisier, who comments on this. And he says that there must be in their social bond something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted among us. For thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those aborigines having, from choice, become Europeans. And now again, we're talking with like 17th century English, so what he's saying is a lot of European colonists would flee and become Indians, but no Indians came over and became Europeans. So, interesting, right? Now, British Parliament wrote laws in 1717 that made transportation to the New World a suitable punishment for crime, if that gives you any idea about how they treated most people in the colonies. This isn't to say that there was no goodness in the colonies, though. There was a middle class of sorts, and people would refer to these as the middling rank of mankind. For example, in the Pennsylvania Journal in 1756, again about 20 years before the Revolution, a journalist writes that the people of the province are generally of the middling sort, and at present pretty much upon a level. They are chiefly industrious farmers, artificers, or men in trade. They enjoy and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them thinks he has a right to civility from the greatest. So we do see a lot of the American egalitarian spirit that we're taught in school, at least in some parts of the colonies. Now, we're getting close to the actual eve of the Revolution, so we could take a quick review of the of life in the colonies up to this point. So starting with Bacon's Rebellion, by the year 1760, there were at least 18 uprisings against colonial government, with like poor farmers trying to overthrow them. There were at least 6 black slave rebellions, and at least 40 other riots of different sorts against taxes and stuff like that. James Otis and Samuel Adams are very famous Bostonians, and they gave speeches that give us some insight into how people saw their position in society at the time. So James Otis said, "I am forced to get my living by the labor of my hand, earned under the frowns of some who have no natural or divine right to be above me, and entirely owe their grandeur and honor to grinding the faces of the poor." Now that's one of Samuel Adams' compatriots. And then a letter to the Boston Gazette in 1763 talks about a few persons in power promoting political projects for keeping the people poor in order to make them humble. Yeah, and that's basically all I've got for you guys today. A couple takeaways is just like Roman history that we've talked about and the Greek history that we've talked about, early American colonial history is also a story of social tension, class differences, people with and without power. It's commented on by most of our founding fathers, actually. And then this led to a lot of conflict. It's not like people were passively accepting it. There was a lot of uprisings, rebellions, and revolts before the actual revolution. So next time, we're going to actually start talking about the real revolution and some more of the memorable events. We're starting to get into the 1700s. Stuff like the Stamp Act and the Boston Tea Party, stuff that almost everybody has heard about at least once or twice whenever they were in school. But tomorrow we'll go back and we'll be talking about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, how to be a good person, how to live happily. And that's all I've got for you guys today. So, as always, it's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your communities today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily. Till next time, I love y'all.